A high-velocity bullet slams into a block of ice at point-blank range. In any other room, the ice would shatter into 1,000 jagged shards. Here, the bullet turns to dust, leaving nothing but a faint scuff mark on the frozen surface. The high-ranking officials in the room don't move. They have just witnessed the impossible. This was not a magic trick performed in a parlor, but a demonstration in a high-security meeting that nearly cost a high-ranking official his life. In the darkest hours of 1942, the British Admiralty was not looking for miracles in steel or fire, but in frozen water and sawdust. They were preparing to build a floating fortress so massive it would dwarf any ship ever constructed, a 2-million-ton island of ice designed to haunt the Atlantic. This was Project Habakkuk, a plan born from sheer desperation and the realization that the ocean was becoming a graveyard for the Allied cause. The Atlantic Ocean in the early 1940s was a place of shadows and sudden death. German U-boats, the Grey Wolves, moved in packs, strangling the supply lines that kept Britain breathing. There was a terrifying stretch of water known as the Black Pit, a mid-Atlantic gap where land-based planes couldn't reach, and the convoys were left entirely defenseless. Steel was a luxury the war effort could no longer afford to waste on experimental hulls. The British were losing ships faster than they could build them. It was within this atmosphere of impending collapse that a man named Geoffrey Pyke entered the room with a proposal that sounded like the fever dream of a madman. Pyke was an eccentric, a man who didn't think in terms of traditional naval architecture, but in terms of survival at any cost. He looked at the vast, freezing expanse of the North Atlantic and saw a building material that was free, abundant, and naturally buoyant. Ice, but standard ice was brittle. A single torpedo or even the natural swell of the sea would crack it like glass. Pyke's breakthrough came when he realized that by mixing ice with a small percentage of wood pulp, he could create a composite material that was as tough as concrete and as resistant to cracking as steel. They named it Pykrete. For a brief, flickering moment in history, it was considered the future of naval warfare. The sheer scale of the proposed vessel, the HMS Habakkuk, is difficult to reconcile with modern engineering. It was envisioned to be 2,000 feet long and 300 feet wide, with walls 40 feet thick. It was not a ship so much as it was a mobile, self-propelled iceberg. The design called for a displacement of 2 million tons, making it 20 times heavier than the largest aircraft carriers in service today. It was meant to carry hundreds of twin-engine bombers into the heart of the Black Pit, providing a permanent, unsinkable airfield in the middle of the storm-tossed sea. It was a vision of a leviathan, a frozen ghost that would be immune to torpedoes because the ice would simply absorb the blast, and any damage could be repaired by pouring in more water and freezing it on the spot. Security around the project was absolute. The British government moved the experimental phase to the secluded wilderness of Jasper National Park in Canada. Under the cover of a boathouse construction, a team of workers built a small-scale prototype on Patricia Lake. The locals saw men working through the freezing nights, shifting massive blocks of frozen material, but they were told nothing. This 60-foot model was the proof of concept, equipped with a refrigeration system to keep the hull from melting during the summer months. It sat there, a strange, blocky monolith of wood and ice, humming with the sound of a 1-horsepower motor defying the natural laws of the Canadian spring. As the sun caught the surface of the prototype, it looked less like a weapon and more like a tomb. The air around it remained unnaturally cold, a localized winter maintained by miles of hidden pipes. Reports from the time suggest that the workers felt a strange sense of unease. They were building something that shouldn't exist, a marriage of the organic and the Arctic that seemed to reject the very water it sat upon. The project was shrouded in such secrecy that even high-ranking naval officers were kept in the dark. Whispered rumors of a frozen fortress circulating through the halls of power like a ghost story. While the prototype held its shape, the reality of the full-scale fortress began to unveil a series of nightmarish logistical hurdles. The physics of ice creep meant that the massive weight of the ship would cause the ice to slowly deform over time, sagging under its own gravity like a slow-motion collapse. To prevent this, the ship would need an internal skeleton of such complexity that it threatened to use more steel than a conventional carrier. Furthermore, the insulation required to keep 2 million tons of ice from liquefying in the fluctuating temperatures of the Atlantic required miles of piping and a refrigeration plant that could power a small city. The interior of the Habakkuk would have been a claustrophobic maze of freezing corridors and humming machinery. Some suggest that the technical failures were merely a convenient excuse to bury a project that had become too psychologically disturbing. The idea of 1,000 men living inside a hollowed-out iceberg for months at a time, surrounded by miles of freezing pipes and the constant creaking of shifting ice, presents a scenario that few were willing to address. The ice fortress would have been a drifting, melting prison in the middle of the Atlantic. The men stationed there would have been living inside a ticking clock, waiting for the ocean to reclaim the material it had lent them. Every time the ice shifted, the sound would have echoed through the hull like a gunshot. The structural integrity of the ship relied entirely on the constant functioning of the refrigeration units. If the power failed, the fortress would not just sink, it would slowly lose its form, turning from a weapon of war into a shapeless mass of slush. The psychological toll on a crew knowing that their entire world was kept solid only by the grace of a few generators is something history has largely ignored. Yet it remains one of the most chilling aspects of the design. The dark irony of Project Habakkuk was that the very desperation that birthed it was also what killed it. As the project dragged on, the war changed. Long-range fuel tanks were developed for patrol bombers, allowing them to finally bridge the Black Pit. The acquisition of airfields in the Azores further closed the gap. The technological race shifted from bigger and tougher to faster and more precise. By 1943, the Admiralty realized that for the cost and time it would take to build one frozen fortress, they could produce an entire fleet of conventional escort carriers. The dream of the ice ship began to thaw, leaving behind questions that still linger about the thin line between genius and the madness of war. Geoffrey Pyke, the visionary who saw a weapon where others saw a wasteland, eventually found himself sidelined. His ideas were deemed too eccentric for a world that was moving toward the atomic age. There is a specific kind of melancholy in the image of that prototype on Patricia Lake, abandoned by its creators, slowly losing its battle with the sun. It didn't sink in a blaze of glory, it simply ceased to be, transitioning from a state of solid defiance back into the water from which it was formed. But the transition was not quick. There are stories that the prototype at Patricia Lake didn't just disappear when the project was abandoned. After the refrigeration was turned off, it took 3 full summers for the massive block of Pykrete to finally melt into the depths. It stood as a silent, decaying monument to an abandoned future, a block of artificial winter that refused to die. Divers who have since explored the floor of the lake have found the skeletal remains of the wooden frame and the rusted pipes, sitting in the silt like the ribs of a fallen prehistoric beast. It is a silent monument to a moment when the world was so close to the edge that a floating mountain of ice seemed like the only logical answer to the darkness. The legacy of the project isn't just in the rotted wood at the bottom of a Canadian lake, but in the realization that there are no limits to what a nation will consider when the alternative is total destruction. We look back at the blueprints for the 2-million-ton carrier and see an absurdity, yet at the time it was discussed in the highest halls of power with absolute gravity. It challenges our understanding of the era, forcing us to ask how many other impossible projects were discussed, tested, and quietly discarded before they could reach the light of day. The Atlantic still hides many things, and the story of the ice ship is a window into a time when the world was cold, the steel was gone, and the only hope was a fortress that was never meant to last. Some accounts suggest that the British were not the only ones experimenting with unconventional materials. The era was rife with wonder weapons and desperate gambles, but Habakkuk stands alone in its attempt to weaponize the very elements of nature. The project remains a mystery of what if, a ghost ship made of frozen water and sawdust that nearly changed the face of the ocean. The ice has long since melted, but the ambition behind it, the willingness to build the impossible in the face of total defeat, remains frozen in the annals of secret history. One must wonder what the sailors of a U-boat would have thought, surfacing in the middle of the North Atlantic only to see a mountain of ice bristling with anti-aircraft guns and launching heavy bombers. It would have looked like a nightmare from an ancient myth, a leviathan of the deep rising to reclaim the surface. The psychological warfare value alone would have been immeasurable, but reality is often less cinematic. The Habakkuk would likely have been a slow, lumbering target, a test of endurance for the men inside as much as for the material itself. The final days of the project were marked by a quiet withdrawal of funds and interest. The files were stamped with secrecy and filed away, becoming a footnote in the history of weird weapons. Today, we look at the rusting pipes in Patricia Lake and see a failure, but perhaps it was a narrow escape. The environmental impact of launching a 2-million-ton block of treated wood and ice into the ecosystem of the Atlantic, followed by the inevitable release of refrigeration chemicals and pulp, could have been a disaster of its own. As the sun sets over Patricia Lake today, the water is calm, hiding the decayed wood of a dream that was too big for the world to hold. The Project Habakkuk files remain yellowed and brittle, detailing a time when men believed they could conquer the sea by becoming part of its most dangerous element. It is a story of ice, sawdust, and the desperate heart of a world at war, a secret fortress that was never built, yet continues to haunt the edges of our historical memory. The mystery that remains is not whether it could have worked. Modern engineers suggest that with enough insulation and power, it might have, but rather what the world would have looked like if it had. A fleet of ice islands patrolling the world's oceans, permanent and cold, would have shifted the balance of naval power in ways we can only speculate about. Perhaps the failure of Project Habakkuk was not a failure of science, but a rare moment where reality caught up with the feverish imagination of wartime planners and whispered that some things were better left to the natural world. The ice ship remains a phantom of the Atlantic, a reminder that during the great struggle, even the ice itself was being drafted into the service of war. The line between a brilliant solution and a disastrous obsession is often as thin as a layer of frost on a window pane. We are left with the image of a bullet bouncing off a block of ice, a moment of genuine shock that redefined what a material could do. It is a reminder that in the dark thriller of human history, the most terrifying and incredible chapters are often the ones that were almost written, but ultimately left in the cold. Some people still claim that the project was never truly abandoned, merely evolved into something else. They point to the secret bases and modern experiments in Arctic warfare as the true descendants of Pyke's frozen dream. Whether that is true or not, The story of the 2-million-ton iceberg serves as a chilling reminder of what happens when human ingenuity is pushed to its absolute limit by the threat of extinction. It was a plan to weaponize the cold of the North Atlantic into a shield against the fire of the U-boats, a secret history that still sits, cold and silent, at the bottom of a mountain lake. The final image of the Habakkuk is not one of a ship at sea, but of a quiet, humming monolith in the Canadian wilderness, a thing out of time and place. It stands as a testament to the fact that in times of total war, there is no such thing as an impossible idea. There are only ideas that have not yet found their moment, and materials that have not yet been tested against the heat of the struggle. The ice has returned to the water, the wood has rotted into the silt, but the shadow of the fortress remains, a cold reminder of the lengths we will go to when the darkness closes in.